Hello, my friends. The real story of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is finally being exposed. A story not of democracy versus dictatorship, but of a collapsing state versus a patient superpower. A story where the battlefield map is only half the truth, and the scandals erupting in Kyiv and Brussels are the other half no one in the West dares to explain. Tonight, we cut through the noise. No propaganda, no fairy tales, no convenient lies. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. Europe is running out of money. And Washington is running out of excuses. Meanwhile, Russia stands stronger, steadier, and more determined than ever to finish what it started. So buckle up. What you're about to hear isn't the narrative you were meant to believe. It's the reality the world will be forced to accept. For anyone still paying attention with a clear head, what's happening in Ukraine right now is not a mystery. Ukraine's army, its state, and its political system are not holding the line. They are disintegrating in slow motion. The collapse isn't just at the front. It's financial, political, and moral. And the West is finally being forced to admit, in whispers, what it spent years screaming was Russian propaganda. Then its support, look at the basics. Desertions at the front are at an all-time high. By some estimates, roughly a quarter of Ukraine's entire order of battle has simply melted away, deserting, surrendering, or disappearing. Men are being thrown to the front, untrained, poorly equipped, and undersupplied. Many are eaten alive within days of arrival. That's not an army on the verge of victory. That's an army being fed into a meat grinder by its own political class and by Western governments who find it easier to sacrifice Ukrainians than admit they were wrong. On the ground, the map tells the story. Towns and cities that Western media obsessed over, like Kupiansk and other nodes along the front, are slowly but steadily slipping under Russian control. Village by village, town by town, Russian forces are advancing along almost the entire line. There are now very few sectors where Russia is not pushing forward. This is what a methodical offensive looks like when a serious state decides it cannot lose because it sees the conflict as existential. Moscow's been clear about that from the beginning. As early as 2007, at Munich, Putin stated openly that NATO's encroachment into Ukraine was a red line for Russia, a matter tied to the existential survival of the Russian Federation. That wasn't vague rhetoric. It was a strategic warning. Western elites laughed it off, convinced of their own invulnerability, addicted to their sense of absolute superiority, and blinded by the money flowing from the military-industrial complex. They told their publics that Russia was losing, Ukraine was winning, and Crimea would be a barbecue destination for NATO tourists. They repeated the same formula they used for Iraq, Libya, Syria, and every other regime they targeted. Demonize the enemy leader, erase context, promise quick victory, and ignore the bill until it comes due. Now the bill has arrived, and it's political, economic, and strategic all at once. Inside Ukraine, the political system is rotting from within. The anti-corruption unit, which was created, funded, and guided by the United States, is preparing indictments against no fewer than dozens upon dozens of members of parliament. Many reports speak of around 77 deputies, all from Zelensky's own faction. His chief of staff has already been forced to resign. There are documents, recordings, cash trails. It's not rumor. It's systemic. For years, anyone who said Ukraine was a cesspool of corruption, that Western money was being stolen while ordinary Ukrainians died, was smeared as a Putin mouthpiece. Now, the very same Western outlets that led that smear campaign are admitting quietly that the Kyiv regime has been looting billions. What were once dismissed as Russian talking points have turned into American and British talking points. The thief of Kyiv is being described as a thief by the very people who once held him up as the new Churchill. You can see the panic in Kyiv. There are reports of Ukrainian politicians sneaking off to Moscow to explore their own separate peace. Everyone inside that elite knows the current arrangement is dying. They can read the polls, they can see the front, and they can feel Washington's attention moving elsewhere. So they're jockeying for position in a post-Zelensky, post-war order, trying to land softly while the country they plundered is in ruins. Financially, the situation is just as dire. The Ukrainian budget for 2026 is a fiction. A huge portion of it, tens of billions of dollars, is unfunded. It assumes roughly $45 billion from Europe just to keep the state functioning day to day, and that's before you even count the military expenditures. In other words, Ukraine is a patient being kept alive on life support, supplied by people who are increasingly unwilling and unable to pay for it. There is no organic economic base in Ukraine that can sustain this war. It is entirely dependent on Western flows of money and weapons, and those flows are drying up. Europe knows it, but can't say it honestly. EU officials talk a big game about standing with Ukraine as long as it takes, but they have no plan B if American funding collapses. NATO's own leaders admit it off the cuff. If Washington steps back, there is no serious alternative. European economies are already straining under the cost of their self-inflicted energy crisis and deindustrialization. Germany's industrial base is in free fall. Energy prices have spiked. Lights are literally being switched off during the winter in some places. This is what I called from day one the boomerang effect of sanctions, and it's hitting Europe harder than Russia. When the first big package of sanctions was introduced, it was sold as a death blow to Russia. The expectation in Western capitals was that Moscow's economy would collapse, the ruble would become worthless, and public unrest would topple the Kremlin. Instead, the opposite happened. Russia reoriented its trade, strengthened its ties with non-Western states, built new supply chains, and proved far more resilient than the West assumed. Meanwhile, European industry is bleeding out, and the political careers of the war leaders in London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels are circling the drain. Look at the quality of leadership in Europe and NATO. You have political pygmies with approval ratings that, if added together, still don't reach 50%. These are people who threatened Russia, promised Ukraine everything, and then discovered they had neither the money, nor the weapons, nor the public support to back it up. They stole their own citizens' money through inflation and energy surcharges, then handed it to a corrupt regime in Kyiv and pretended this was some noble crusade for democracy. Now, the mask is slipping. A massive corruption scandal is blowing open inside the EU institutions themselves. Senior foreign policy figures and ex-officials in Brussels have been raided and arrested over alleged multi-million euro fraud. This is not some fringe case. It strikes at the heart of the same European establishment that pushed the confrontation with Russia and sold it as a moral imperative. The public is beginning to see that the same people who ruined their industries and sacrificed Ukraine's young men were also presiding over large-scale theft inside their own bureaucracy. This is why you see such open contempt for NATO among serious people. Now, NATO has revealed itself as what some of us always said it was, a bluff. On paper, Trent plus nations, massive GDP, huge armies. In reality, when faced with the prospect of actually confronting Russia directly, not bombing some defenseless state in the Middle East, but facing a peer adversary, nobody in their right mind in London, Berlin, or Paris wants to march east. The President of the United States can't even be bothered to show up to a NATO summit. European leaders talk tough, but they have no appetite, no resources, and no plan. The United States, for its part, has combined staggering arrogance with deep corruption. You have retired generals and ex-officials appearing on television telling the public that Ukraine can still win if it just receives a little more money. These people are not neutral analysts. They're on the payroll. They sit on boards, work for defense contractors, and feed at the trough of the military-industrial complex. They don't see a tragedy in Ukraine. They see a revenue stream. Underneath all this is a rotten strategic assumption that the United States is absolutely superior, unchallengeable, invincible. It's the same mindset that drove the British Empire into the First World War and started its decline. Nobody in Washington seems genuinely concerned with the primary duty of any statesman, the survival and well-being of their own people. Instead, they're part of a globalist game designed to extract wealth and power, even if it burns down their own societies in the process. Against that, Russia has done something very unfashionable in the West. It has shown patience, restraint, and a clear sense of its own interests. Putin did not flood Ukraine with troops, did not bomb everything flat, did not chase quick headlines. He applied force where necessary, conserved manpower, and let the economic and political realities catch up with Western illusions. For years, Western pundits mistook that caution for weakness, just as they once misunderstood Stalin's cold, methodical will. They forgot that when a great power sees an existential threat, it will use everything it has rather than accept defeat. Now we arrive at the diplomatic theater. Envoys like Kushner and Witkoff strolling around Moscow, touring Red Square like tourists, while Ukraine's leadership panics and Europe gnashes its teeth at being left out of the process. Trump's circle clearly wanted a photo op, a handshake with Putin, a piece of paper, and a claim that he ended the Ukraine war. But here's the problem. You can't rescue something from wreckage when nothing is left. There's no longer a meaningful deal to be made over Ukraine's battlefield position. Russia holds the initiative and will keep pushing until it secures political terms that guarantee its security. That's why serious observers in Ukraine itself describe the domestic situation as catatonic. The regime can still pass a budget on paper, still hold speeches, still arrest and harass opponents, but the underlying conditions, unfunded bills, collapsing military capacity, exhausted Western support, are pushing the state toward a point where no one can predict how the pieces will land. And remember, any future Ukrainian election, whenever it happens, will be held with millions of former Ukrainian citizens living under Russian administration or in Russia proper, unable or unwilling to vote in a Kyiv-organized ballot. The electorate that elected Zelensky won't be the electorate that chooses what comes next. So what are the options? In reality, there are only two, and they are linked. Either there is a political settlement that recognizes the new realities on the ground, Russia's territorial gains, Ukraine's military defeat, and formal limits on Kyiv's armed forces and foreign policy. Or Russia will continue advancing until that political reality is undeniable. One leads to the other. The longer the West clings to fantasies about retaking Crimea or driving Russia back to 1,991 borders, the more territory Ukraine will lose, and the worse its bargaining position will become. There are hints inside the negotiation frameworks, like buffer zones, restrictions on Ukrainian force levels, and guarantees about weapons systems that could secure Russia's core interests without requiring it to annex everything. But that presupposes rational partners on the other side. And so far, the Ukrainian leadership and its Western backers H. Meanwhile, Western propaganda continues to recycle the same tropes. Russia as the new Hitler, Putin as the latest in a long line of cartoon villains, any dissent as treason. They use the same script against Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Assad, and now Putin. They invent absurd stories, like the old claim that Gaddafi handed out Viagra to his troops, and the media dutifully amplifies them. The result is a public that has been lied to for decades, and an elite that has never been held accountable for Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or Syria, and is now repeating the pattern in Ukraine. But something is changing. The lies are less effective because alternative voices exist, because the economic pain is real, and because the battlefield reality is too obvious to deny. When people in Europe are told they must freeze in the dark for Ukraine, but then discover their leaders were presiding over massive corruption at home and theft in Kyiv, they start to ask questions. When they see that it is not Russia collapsing, but German industry and European living standards, they begin to wonder who the real enemy is. The bottom line is this: Russia understood from the start that it could not lose this war. It was a question of survival, not prestige. The West treated it like another regime change campaign, a TV show that could be managed by PR, think tank talking points, and deficit spending. One side approached it as an existential struggle, the other as a money-making opportunity and a chance to posture. We are now seeing which worldview was grounded in reality. Ukraine has been used bled, and abandoned. Its ruling class stole whatever it could. Western elites used it to launder money, justify military budgets, and posture as defenders of democracy while crushing dissent at home. And Russia, slowly and relentlessly, has broken the military threat on its border and exposed the hollowness of NATO and the European Union as serious strategic actors. When the shooting stops, whether through a formal treaty or because there is nothing left of Ukraine to fight with, the war will not truly be over. The same Western elites who lied, looted, and blundered into this disaster will try to continue the conflict by other means: sanctions, sabotage, terrorist proxies, information warfare. They cannot admit defeat, cannot admit they lied, cannot admit that they hugged a corrupt comedian in fatigues and sold him as a statesman while he presided over the largest theft in modern European history. Russia, for its part, will do what it has always said it would: secure its vital interests, protect its population, and refuse to submit to a strategic encirclement designed in Washington and Brussels. The question is not whether Russia comes out of this war intact. It will. The real question is how much of Europe's political and economic architecture will still be standing when the dust settles, and how long it will take for Western publics to realize that the true threat to their future didn't come from Moscow, but from the people who lied them into this catastrophe in the first place.